It took me many years to edit my Mentavia material, and some still awaits working on it. During several later visits, I could complement the results of my first stay there, but my tasks at the Free University enabled me also to travel to other places in Indonesia, sometimes in combination with a period of practical training with the students. This gave me the opportunity to work on some selective topics that, while staying in the region, had attracted our attention. During a campaign among the Batak people in northern Sumatra, I was called by the local missionary, and he said, I have big problems because people suddenly begin again to construct enormous figures made from painted concrete, and I'm afraid they are just falling back into their old Hessian customs. And couldn't you please talk to people why they are Christians and why they are doing these things? They started to do that since the 60s, and when you travel through Batak country, indeed you find oval monuments standing between the Sava fields like this. I have here a photograph of one of my students of such a monument here. You can see it. It's a man and a woman on a basis. But it was certainly not a general case of ethnic revival, as this missionary was afraid of, because many other things the Batak had in their culture. For instance, their beautiful large adat houses, the traditional longhouses, were neglected and even collapsing. And they went to church on Sundays. So this was not the point. And some years later, I came across a similar phenomenon of new ethnic manifestation during conducting field research into the intricate architecture of the Southern Toraja, a people living in Sulawesi and Celebes. And I did this together with a fellow anthropologist, a photographer, and an architect. The Toraja were known by their beautiful traditional houses, like in fact the Batak in former times were as well. But in contrast to them, these houses were well preserved and much taken care of. And in combination with huge festivities, they were occasionally even rebuilt in more and more spectacular shapes. They were upkept by people that had attached themselves to the community the house belonged to on the ground of common relationship by blood and individual affinity to the localities. We find here such a traditional house which has been renovated, has a roof of corrugated iron, and is the center of a group living there in the vicinity. The building of these groups was made possible by donations of Toraja people who had moved outside to the towns at the coast and sent regularly money back, so that the maintenance was made possible. And the Toraja too had wooden figures, the so-called tautau, which perhaps some of you have seen in art catalogues, but they are much more modest in shape and remain in the personal sphere of the makers. And I always wanted to understand local developments in relationship with peculiarities in their background. In this case, an explanation of the contrasts in the two cases could soon be found. In differences in the social organization. The Batak are a prototype of a classical patrilineal society which, with apical mythical ancestors and with genealogical heads of later branches. And it's precisely these figures which are embodied in the monuments made of concrete. So I could reassure the local missionary that the making of these figures was not a problem of a Hessen revival, but just a means of endorsing the spirit of community by referring to the people they all felt themselves descendants of. Now, such leading genealogical personalities were absent in the bilateral social organization of the Toraja. They too feel the need to mark the community, but in the absence of clear marked figures in this community, they concentrate on that which is the spatial focus of the life of their gatherings, the local house, quite in line with what Lévi-Strauss has called Société à maison. And in both cases, the devotion to this symbol of community was more than just a primordial emotion, not just a sentimental feeling of connected. What was so interesting was that the people in the towns who gave the money to upkeep and construct these things, in this way calculated on access to a secure harbor in the uncertainties of modern life. Working at the university on Indonesian topics had always also a political side. Relationships between Indonesia and the Netherlands were not always easy. In some years it was impossible for the students to get the necessary visa. And my own position was difficult too. In Indonesia in those years, still efforts were combined of nation building with a strategy of forced assimilation for the tribal groups, punishing adherents of traditional life, forbidding animism and prescribing adoption of a monotheistic religion. I have mentioned this already in connection with my first contact with Sakkudei. I never made it a secret that I was a fervent opponent against these genocidal tendencies. And in the end, they have resulted in the loss of an irreplaceable cultural heritage in many societies of Indonesia. When living with Sakkudei, I had promised them to help them in their wish for self-determination, and as long as I stayed with them, my official tasks of documenting their traditions meant a certain protection. Soon after my departure, however, the situation seemed worsening. Reports of punishments of shamanic activities in combination with burning shamanic equipments by the police arrived together with plans of the Indonesian government to lock over the forests of most parts of the Mentawai Islands. It was obvious that this would have detrimental environmental consequences, as I was able to demonstrate in my second film documentary made in 1974 for Granada TV in England. I approached all possible allies, and finally, with the help of the WWF, this organization Survival International, a grant of the Dutch government, and the outcomes of an international symposium that was organized in Sumatra together with Gerard Passon, it was possible to launch the first of a series of comparable projects with various donors to counter the logging and to come to an agreement with the government towards a more liberal and tolerant attitude, involving more people, freedom for the people to make their own choices. Fortunately, towards the end of the 20th century, the genius of the period had also begun to change all over Indonesia. It was the time of Indonesia as a tourist destination. Travel to Indonesia was everywhere propagated, and of course tourists came just to see these things which the official old way of the government had forbidden. This contributed to the change in the governmental policies to be more liberal, and to allow things which formerly had forbidden. Today one can still see a thriving longhouse community in southern Siberut, based on the continuous flow of a tradition that otherwise probably would have been interrupted and had gone lost. How much and to what degree Mentawaians want to cherish their inherited identity in the future is now in their own hands. That is this.